The air hung thick with sweat and anticipation inside the AT&T Stadium in Arlington, Texas. 70,000 voices merged into a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very foundation of the massive structure. Under the brilliant glare of stadium lights that turned night into artificial day, Mike Tyson stood in the center of the ring, his chest heaving, his face glistening with perspiration that caught the light like diamonds. At 58 years old, his body bore the roadmap of a warrior's life, scars etched into skin that had absorbed thousands of punches, muscles that still rippled beneath the surface despite the passage of decades. The final bell had rung. The fight was over, and in that moment, as the crowd's thunder washed over him in waves, Mike Tyson wasn't thinking about the spectacle he just delivered. He wasn't calculating his legacy or measuring his performance against the ghosts of his younger self. His eyes searched the ringside seats until they found her. Lakiha Spicer Kiki, as he called her, sat there with tears streaming down her face, her hands pressed against her mouth, her entire body trembling with the release of tension she'd carried for months. She had watched him train, watched him sacrifice, watched him push a body that had every right to rest back into the brutal crucible of professional combat. And now, as cameras flashed like lightning and reporters jostled for position, Mike knew, with absolute certainty, what he was going to do with the $20 million he just earned. In a world where athletes divorce over prenuptial agreements and celebrities measure love in Instagram likes, Mike Tyson was about to do something that would stun the world, not with his fists this time, but with his heart. To understand the magnitude of what Mike Tyson would do in the aftermath of this fight, you have to understand the man himself, not the caricature, not the meme, not the highlight reel of knockouts that made him the youngest heavyweight champion in history. You have to understand the broken boy from Bronzeville, Brooklyn, who lost his mother at 16, who found salvation in the arms of a trainer named Kiki, who climbed to heights so dizzying that the fall nearly killed him. Mike Tyson's story reads like a Shakespearean tragedy that somehow found redemption in its final act. Born into poverty in 1966, young Michael grew up in one of New York City's most dangerous neighborhoods, where survival meant learning to fight before you learned to read properly. His father abandoned the family. His mother, Lorna, struggled with illness and the impossible task of raising 3 children alone. Mike was bullied for his high-pitched voice and lisp, until the day he discovered that his fists could silence mockery more effectively than words ever could. By age 13, he'd been arrested 38 times. The streets were claiming him, pulling him toward a future that ended in a cell or a grave. Then came Kiki, the eccentric boxing trainer who saw something in this troubled teenager that no one else had seen: a champion's heart beating beneath layers of pain and rage. Kis became the father Mike never had, molding him not just into a fighter, but into a force of nature. Under Kis's guidance, Mike learned to channel his fury into disciplined violence, transforming raw aggression into the sweet science of boxing. At 20 years old, he became the youngest heavyweight champion in history, a title he still holds. The world watched in awe as Iron Mike dismantled opponents with combinations so fast and powerful they seemed superhuman. He was earning millions per fight, living in a mansion with Bengal tigers as pets, driving luxury cars, dating movie stars. But money and fame are poor substitutes for the steady love Kiki had provided, and when Kis died just a year after Mike won the championship, the young fighter lost his anchor. What followed was a descent that played out in tabloid headlines, and prison sentences, a rape conviction that cost him 3 years of his prime, a bite that removed a piece of Evander Holyfield's ear and shocked the sports world, divorces that drained his bank accounts, business managers who robbed him blind, and a bankruptcy filing in 2003 that revealed a man who'd earned over $300 million had less than nothing left. Through it all, through the chaos and the darkness, through addiction and depression that brought him to the edge of suicide, Mike Tyson was learning the hardest lesson of his life, that the same ferocity that made him a champion in the ring made him a disaster in relationships. His first marriage to actress Robin Givens ended in tabloid warfare. His second marriage to Monica Turner ended when she filed for divorce, citing his adultery. He was a man who could conquer any opponent but couldn't conquer himself, who could earn millions in minutes but couldn't find peace in the silence that followed. Then, in 2000, amid the wreckage of his life, a woman named Lakiha Spicer walked back into his world. They'd met years earlier when she was just 18, introduced through her father, Shamsuddin Ali, a prominent Muslim cleric in Philadelphia who knew Mike through boxing circles. But their romantic relationship didn't truly begin until years later, when Mike was at his lowest point broken, and barely holding on. Kiki, as friends and family called her, saw past the headlines. She saw past the tattoos and the troubled history. She saw the man beneath the monster that media had created, the vulnerable human being who'd been performing for crowds since he was barely more than a child himself. Their early years together were far from a fairy tale. Kiki herself had legal troubles, serving a brief prison sentence for fraud in 2008, just months before they married in a private ceremony at the La Bella Wedding Chapel in Las Vegas. Critics and gossip columnists had a field day, predicting the marriage would crash and burn like all Mike's previous relationships. But something different was happening this time. Kiki wasn't dazzled by fame or fortune. She'd seen Mike at his absolute worst, penniless and drowning in debt. She chose to stay not because of what he could give her, but because of who he was beneath everything the world had made him. The journey back to the ring had begun almost 2 years earlier, when whispers started circulating that Mike Tyson might be considering a return to boxing. At first, the rumors seemed absurd. A man approaching 60, long retired, with nothing left to prove and everything to lose. But those who knew Mike understood that boxing had never truly left his blood. It wasn't about money, at least not initially. It was about proving to himself that he could still do it, that the warrior spirit Kisdamato had cultivated for decades earlier still burned somewhere inside the aging body. When the official announcement came that Mike would fight again, the world reacted with a mixture of excitement and concern. Social media exploded with debates about whether this was inspirational or irresponsible. ESPN analysts argued back and forth about the wisdom of allowing a man of his age back into professional combat. But at home in their Henderson, Nevada residence, a different conversation was taking place. Kiki sat across from Mike at their kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, her eyes searching his face for the truth beneath his words. "Are you sure?" she asked, not for the first time. Really sure, and Mike, who had spent his entire life hiding vulnerability behind aggression, who had built walls so thick that most people never saw past them, let his wife see him completely. "I need to do this," he told her. "Not for the money, not for the glory. I need to prove to myself that I'm still that person, that I didn't waste everything Kiss gave me." She understood, even though understanding didn't make it easier. For months, she watched him transform their home gym into a torture chamber where he battled against time itself. At an age when most men are thinking about retirement communities and golf courses, Mike was running miles before dawn, hitting bags until his knuckles bled through the wraps, sparring with fighters half his age who looked at him with a mixture of respect and disbelief. Kiki was there for every brutal morning, every ice bath, every moment when his body screamed at him to stop but his spirit refused to quit. The training camp was grueling in ways that had nothing to do with physical conditioning. Mike had to lose 50 pounds, had to rebuild muscle memory that age had eroded, had to convince a body that had been retired for 15 years to become a weapon once more. There were days when the pain was so intense that he could barely walk, when inflammation in his sciatic nerve left him hobbling like a man twice his age. Kiki became not just his wife, but his nurse, his therapist, his anchor to sanity when the doubts crept in during the darkest hours before dawn. She fielded the concerned calls from their children, reassuring them that their father knew what he was doing, even when she herself wasn't entirely sure. She deflected the media circus that camped outside their home, creating a barrier between Mike and the world so he could focus entirely on the monumental task ahead. She watched him sacrifice comfort, safety, and peace for this one last dance with the only thing that had ever made him feel truly alive besides her love. The financial details of the fight were staggering. $20 million from Mike's purse alone, an amount that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier when he was still digging out from bankruptcy. The promotional machine kicked into high gear, with press conferences and weigh-ins that generated the kind of global attention usually reserved for championship fights between fighters in their prime. But for Mike, the money was abstract, numbers on a contract that meant less than the simple act of being able to still do what he was born to do. Fight night arrived like the culmination of a religious pilgrimage. The stadium filled hours before the first bell, with 70,000 fans and millions more watching on pay-per-view around the world. Celebrities filled the front rows, actors, musicians, athletes from other sports, all drawn by the spectacle of a legend, refusing to let time have the final word. In the locker room, as his trainers wrapped his hands and checked his gloves, Mike sat in silence, his head bowed, his breathing deep and controlled. Kiki stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder, saying nothing because no words could capture what they both felt. The walk to the ring seemed to stretch into eternity. The crowd's roar grew louder with each step, building into a wall of sound that would have overwhelmed a lesser man. But Mike had heard this music before, had felt this energy lift him up and carry him forward since he was 20 years old. The lights caught every scar, every tattoo, every line that time had carved into his face. He looked older than his years, withered by a life lived in the extremes, but his eyes held a clarity that had been missing for decades. The fight itself was everything and nothing like his prime years. He didn't have the explosive speed that had made him famous, the ability to close distance and deliver combinations so fast that opponents couldn't process what was happening until they were already falling. But he had wisdom, patience, and a courage that only comes from surviving things worse than anything an opponent can deliver. For 8 rounds, he showed the world that, while time is undefeated, it can still be challenged. He absorbed punches that would have dropped younger men, delivered shots that echoed through the stadium, and demonstrated that the heart D'Amato had forged could still beat strong under pressure. When the final bell rang, the result almost didn't matter. Win or lose by judge's decision, Mike Tyson had already won something more important. He'd proven to himself that he was still the warrior he'd always been, that age could slow him but not break him, that the spirit that had carried him from Bronzeville projects to worldwide fame still burned bright. But standing in the center of that ring, his arm raised by the referee, his body screaming with exhaustion and pain, Mike Tyson's thoughts weren't on his performance or his legacy. His eyes found Kiki again, and in that moment, a decision that had been forming in his heart for months crystallized into absolute certainty. The $20 million he just earned, the money that represented 6 months of brutal training and 8 rounds of combat at an age when most men are content to watch fights from their couches, he would give every penny of it to the woman who had saved his life. The announcement came 3 days after the fight, during what was supposed to be a routine press conference about future plans and thank yous to sponsors. Mike sat at a table, microphones clustered in front of him like a forest of metal flowers, cameras creating a constant flash of artificial lightning. Kiki wasn't supposed to be there. She generally avoided the media circus, preferring to support Mike from behind the scenes. But he'd insisted she attend, and she sat off to the side, confused about why her presence was so important for what should have been a standard post-fight media obligation. Mike answered the expected questions about his performance, his health, his future in boxing. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, he shifted the conversation in a direction no one had anticipated. "I want to talk about something more important than anything that happened in that ring," he said, his voice carrying that distinctive lisp that he'd learned long ago to embrace rather than hide. "I want to talk about the woman who saved my life." The room fell silent, reporters sensing that something significant was about to happen, but not yet understanding what. Mike turned to look at Kiki, and those who knew him well could see tears forming in eyes that had stared down the most dangerous man on the planet without flinching. "Everything I earned from that fight, every dollar of that $20 million purse I'm giving to my wife," he said. "Not giving it to us, not putting it in some joint account, giving it to her, completely, because she earned it more than I did." The press room erupted. Questions flew like punches, rapid fire and overlapping. But Mike held up his hand for silence, and somehow, impossibly, the room obeyed. What followed was perhaps the most honest, vulnerable moment of his entire public life, a confession and a love letter delivered in front of the world. "You all know my history," he continued. "You know the mistakes I've made, the money I've wasted, the people I've hurt. When Kiki and I got together, I had nothing, less than nothing. I was millions in debt. My reputation was destroyed, and I honestly didn't know if I could survive another year. She could have walked away. She should have walked away. But she stayed." His voice cracked slightly, and he paused to regain composure. "She stayed through the bankruptcy. She stayed through the depression so bad I could barely get out of bed. She stayed when I was so broke we had to worry about paying basic bills. She didn't stay for the fame, because I was a punchline by then. She didn't stay for the money, because there wasn't any. She stayed because she saw something in me that I'd forgotten was there, the person I could be if someone actually believed in me." Kiki was crying openly now, her hands pressed to her face, shaking her head as if to protest this public declaration. But Mike wasn't finished. "That fight happened because she made it possible. Every morning when I didn't want to get up, she got me up. Every time I wanted to quit, she reminded me why I was doing it. Every doubt, every fear, every moment of pain, she carried half of it for me. That $20 million, that's not my money, that's hers. She earned every penny of it, and I want the world to know that." The story went viral within hours. In an era dominated by celebrity divorces, prenuptial agreements, and relationships that seemed to exist primarily for Instagram content, Mike Tyson's gesture struck a chord that resonated far beyond the sports world. Social media exploded with reactions ranging from deeply moved to cynically skeptical. Some praised Mike as a model of how men should honor their partners. Others questioned whether it was a publicity stunt. Though anyone who'd followed Mike's career knew he'd never been particularly skilled at or interested in manipulating public opinion for positive press. Financial experts were called in to analyze the implications. $20 million, even after taxes, represented generational wealth, the kind of money that could be invested and provide security for children and grandchildren. Some financial advisors praised the gesture as romantic, but questioned the wisdom of placing such a large sum entirely in one person's control. Others pointed out that Mike and Kiki had been married for over 15 years at that point, had children together, and that in most practical senses, the money would benefit their family regardless of whose name was on the accounts. But these analyses missed the point entirely. This wasn't about financial strategy or asset protection. It was about a man who'd spent most of his life taking punches, taking money, taking advantage of people's goodwill, finally giving something that mattered. It was about recognizing that the person who stands beside you in the darkness is more valuable than anything you can achieve in the spotlight. In the days and weeks that followed, stories began to emerge that painted a fuller picture of Kiki's role in Mike's redemption. Friends and family members shared anecdotes about how she'd restructured his finances, hired competent managers to replace the leeches who drained his fortune, and created a stable home environment for the first time in his adult life. She'd encouraged his podcast, Hot Boxin' with Mike Tyson, which became a surprising success and helped rehabilitate his public image. She'd supported his one-man show and various acting roles that allowed him to explore creative outlets beyond fighting. More importantly, she'd helped him become a father in ways he'd never managed during his previous relationships. Mike had children from prior marriages, relationships complicated by his absence and instability during their formative years. With Kiki, he learned to be present, to attend school functions, to be the kind of dad who helped with homework and showed up for recitals. She didn't just save Mike from himself, she gave him the chance to break the cycle of abandonment that had defined his own childhood. Their children, Milan and Morocco, born in 2008 and 2011 respectively, grew up in a household defined by stability rather than chaos, with parents who demonstrated daily that love meant showing up even when it was difficult. Mike, who'd once been perhaps the most frightening man on the planet, learned to braid his daughter's hair, to navigate the complexities of princess-themed birthday parties, to be gentle in ways his own life had never taught him. The media gradually shifted from sensationalizing the $20 million gift to exploring what it represented, a complete reversal of traditional gender dynamics. In an age where such discussions had become increasingly relevant, here was a man, particularly a man whose hyper-masculine image had been central to his public persona, openly acknowledging that his success was impossible without his wife's support. He wasn't emasculated by this admission. If anything, it demonstrated a strength far more impressive than physical dominance. Kiki herself remained largely silent in the immediate aftermath, uncomfortable with the spotlight that Mike had thrust upon her. She eventually released a brief statement that was characteristically modest. "Mike has always been generous with the people he loves. I'm grateful for his gesture, but the greatest gift he's given me is becoming the man I always knew he could be." It was the response of someone who understood that the money, while significant, was merely a symbol of something deeper and more valuable. In the years since Mike Tyson's stunning declaration, the gesture has taken on a significance that extends far beyond the two people directly involved. In a culture increasingly dominated by transactional relationships and performative displays of affection on social media, Mike's gift represented something increasingly rare: authentic gratitude expressed through meaningful sacrifice. The story forced uncomfortable conversations about how we value the invisible labor that makes public success possible. For every athlete, celebrity, or business leader standing in the spotlight, there are often partners behind the scenes managing the chaos, providing emotional support, creating stability, and carrying burdens that never make it into highlight reels. Mike's gesture acknowledged this reality in a way that felt revolutionary precisely because it should have been ordinary. It challenged traditional narratives about masculinity and strength, particularly within the sports world where vulnerability is often equated with weakness. Mike Tyson, a man who'd built his identity on being the baddest person in any room, demonstrated that true strength includes the courage to be humble, to acknowledge dependence on others, to publicly credit your success to someone else's sacrifice. He showed that the strongest thing a powerful man can do is recognize and honor the power of the person who chose to stand beside him. For those struggling with their own demons, addiction, depression, financial ruin, relationship failures, Mike and Kiki's story offered a blueprint for redemption that didn't rely on individual willpower alone. Mike had tried and failed countless times to fix himself in isolation. Real change came when he accepted love from someone willing to see his potential despite his past, and when he committed to becoming worthy of that faith. Their relationship demonstrated that healing is often a collaborative process, that you don't have to be perfect to deserve support, and that the right partnership can literally save your life. The $20 million gift also sparked broader discussions about wealth, marriage, and financial equity within relationships. In a legal and cultural landscape still working through questions about economic justice between partners, particularly when one person's career advancement depends on the other person's unpaid domestic labor, Mike's gesture offered a powerful, if informal, model. He wasn't waiting for a divorce court to calculate her contribution to his success. He was proactively acknowledging that her work had equal or greater value to his own. Perhaps most powerfully, the story reminded people that change is possible at any age, that it's never too late to become a better version of yourself. Mike Tyson was 58 years old when he returned to the ring, and over 50 when he made this grand romantic gesture. His life's narrative could easily have ended as a cautionary tale about wasted potential and squandered opportunities. Instead, through Kiki's love and his willingness to accept it, his story became one of redemption, growth, and the transformative power of being truly seen by another person. In the end, Mike Tyson's $20 million gift of love stands as a testament to a simple but profound truth, that the greatest wealth isn't measured in bank accounts or championship belts, but in the people who stand beside us when the lights go dark and the crowds go home. In recognizing this, Mike Tyson, the troubled kid from Bronzeville, the youngest heavyweight champion in history, the man who'd lost everything and climbed back from nothing, finally won the fight that mattered most, not against an opponent in the ring, but against the isolation and selfishness that had defined so much of his life. And in that victory, he became the champion D'Amato always believed he could be, not just of boxing, but of his own broken and beautifully reconstructed heart.